Welcome to today's video where we are going to talk about doing a blended shadow versus a hard edge shadow. Now I painted this in fall colors, but we're going to paint it using our greens like it's summertime because it's a little chilly right now. So I want that warmth of summer. And let's kind of talk about how to do the two different ones. So we're going to start with blended first on the left side, and then on the right, we're going to do a hard edge. Now for today, I am using an 8 round brush, and this is a Creative Mark, and then Ebony Splendor is the style of this brush. Now, I'm just going to jump right into this. So I'm gonna get my brush wet, and for a blended, the key to getting a blended shadow and having everything be very soft is making sure we work wet into wet. So we're gonna grab our greens, and this is my green gold. I'm gonna add onto my palette. I'm gonna get just a little bit mixed up here. And then I'm also just gonna add in a little bit of my lemon yellow as well. Have a really nice bright green to start off with. Now, what I'm gonna do is come in and get all of this tree, all of the leaves part, wet with this paint. Now you could also wet your paper first, but I'm working on dry paper right now. Either one works. And that's the beauty of watercolor that I love so much, is there's so many different ways to approach a painting. Even something like this, by keeping soft edges, there's multiple ways you can get soft blended edges. So this is one way to do it. And I also like, really quick, while I still have this color on my brush, to just come put a few kind of marks outside the edging of the tree. It kind of just adds a little bit to it. So I'm just gonna add a little. Okay, now while it's still wet, this is the key to get a nice soft blended edge, is we're gonna start getting our nice darker values in there. So I'm gonna use ultramarine blue. And I'm gonna just add that into the mixture I already had on my palette. And I'm gonna use a little bit of my Hooker's green too. And now I'm gonna start adding this in, and because it's still wet, that's gonna spread. And so we're not gonna get a hard edge. It's gonna stay really nice and soft. We're gonna add that into these little markings. And right now I'm hanging closer to the bottom of the tree, and then I'm slowly gonna kind of carry this up a little bit in here, get a little more of my brush. So my sun direction is kind of coming from the left side, so that's kind of why I'm working more on the back right side and also underneath the tree as well, because it's gonna be a little bit darker in there. A little bit on the back side up here. And so right now, again, that's staying really nice and blended. And even as it's gonna dry, you're gonna see how soft that's gonna stay. Now, I'm gonna go and just add a slightly darker value into there. So I'm gonna add a little more ultramarine blue into this mixture. And then to darken it just a little bit more, I'm gonna use Green's Complement, which is red. So I'm gonna add just a little bit of red, and that'll help get just that much darker. A little more ultramarine blue. And I'm gonna add that in just a few spots, again, just because this is still wet. And so as long as your painting is still wet, you can keep working into it. The issue that you can start having problems in and blooms, if you don't want blooms, is when it gets into that half drying stage. You don't really want to keep painting into it. And so right now I'm gonna add just a little bit of these darker tones. And I think I'm gonna call that good. on there, and then I'm gonna rinse out my paintbrush. And then what I'm gonna do real quick is I'm gonna paint in the tree trunk just so that it's easier then to see this completed tree. So real quick, I'm gonna grab some burnt sienna, a little ultramarine blue, and a little cat orange. And because this is still wet, I am letting this kind of touch into the green area. And that's just gonna add a nice little darkness into those spots too. Again, keeping it really nice and blended, soft. So the nice thing, if you're doing a soft blended edge, is you don't have to worry about waiting for it to dry or pulling out your blow dryer because you're working wet into wet. So it's a little bit more quicker than working with a hard edge. So let's get into using a hard edge. Again, I'm gonna start off with working on dry paper. And I'm gonna work kind of with similar colors as well, just so that you can see the difference and really be able to compare. So again, I'll start off with my green gold. Add in a little lemon yellow. And then I'm just gonna add a touch of Hooker's green into that, just so it's not too bright. Yeah, that looks really similar. Okay, so same process for this first layer. We're just gonna fill in the entire tree. Okay, now here's where the difference is gonna be. We're gonna let that dry, or if you have a heat gun dry or a blow dryer, whatever you have, or if you wanna just step away for about probably 10 minutes to let this completely dry. Then we're gonna come back and paint in our darker values, and that's gonna make all the difference with getting a hard edge shadow versus a blended shadow. So I'm gonna pull out my blow dryer right now and get this completely dry. Using the back of your hand to check, you have less oil, so I usually try and do that if I'm concerned with if it's dry or not, just to do a really quick check. And now that that's dry, we can come in and start adding those darker shadows into here. And because we're working on dry paper, it's going to not be soft and blended like how we did over here, because when your paper is wet and you put the wet paint into it, it just naturally spreads and softens on its own. When I had my heat gun out drying this, I also was drying this one as well, so that you can kind of see the final look of that. And you can see it's very, very soft and subtle and blended and smooth with those transitions from kind of our light areas into our dark areas. Now, I'm gonna show you after we paint this one that we can still come back in and add some soft shadows as a second layer if you want, and I'll show you how to do that to keep it soft. But this is done technically within that first layer. You don't have to come back. All I have to do is just add, a little bit of some grass on the bottom, and then that one is done. But like I said, I'll come back into that one in a second and show you how to add another darker value into it and keep it soft. All right, so let's come back into the hard edge. Now that it's dry, I'm going to get a little bit of my Hooker's green, a little bit of my ultramarine blue. So now I have a darker green kind of mixed up. We're just kind of like, this was more of a light yellowy green. So now I just have like a normal green mixed up. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of come in and stay towards the bottom again of this tree. Because again, my sun is kind of coming from this direction. So I know the bottom is where my darker values are gonna lie. And you can see wherever my paintbrush goes, like the minute my paintbrush stops with the line, the paint stops there. It doesn't keep spreading and extending out past where I paint. So there's a lot of control this way, and the paint only goes where you want it to go when you're painting on dry paper. And so that's why I kind of call this like a hard edge shadow, because the edges your paintbrush is creating right now is all based on where you put your paintbrush, and then it just stops. And technically you would use a combination of both of these in a painting. I wouldn't necessarily only paint with hard edges or only paint with soft blended edges. They work well together. I like doing compare and contrast to see the huge difference if you do one or the other. But at the end of the day, typically when I'm painting, I'm using a mixture of both of these. But again, I think it's fun just to kind of see if you only did hard edges or you only did soft blended edges. So I'm kind of just staying to the right edge and, you know, letting some little marks be here or there. So it kind of looks like little tiny leaves, but that's gonna stay kind of it for this layer, because to do now another darker layer, I have to dry again in between so that that can stay exactly how I painted it. Because if I come in with a darker layer right now and add that in, it's gonna be soft and blended. And so we're showing this very, you know, one or the other. So now we're gonna dry and do another layer so that you're gonna see those distinct layers with the hard edge. And you're gonna be able to see, okay, here's my light green, yellowy green, and then here's my normal green. And then we're gonna come in with a final layer with that dark green that we did down here. And it's very separate as far as being able to see everything versus this. Again, they kind of all blend together, so you don't really notice as much the different like colorings you're even using. So it's kind of cool to see, and we'll dry this and come back in with that next color. Okay, so now on my palette, I'm just going to add in a little bit more ultramarine blue, a little more Hooker's green in there. And again, just a little bit of red will kind of take that down even more. I don't feel like I have enough mixed up, so I'm just gonna add some more of those exact same colors. Okay, now that I have enough mixed up, I'm gonna come again on the same area I painted last time, but I'm not gonna paint over all of it. I'm gonna kind of paint over 60, 70% of it. And it's gonna add a nice darker kind of shadow and value in here. Okay, and then I think that's it for that one. Again, because we're working on dry paper, everything is staying a hard edge. So, you know, we've got all these little marks that we do. They stay exactly where we paint them. This kind of way of painting is fun to do, just to experiment with it and see that there's such a different way you can paint with watercolors. It's more of almost like kind of sometimes like a graphic design type style is how I even think of it, which it's fun to, again, know you have so many options with watercolor. And then you have, you know, one side super blended, one side hard edge, and you've got all of this in between on this scale of how you can paint. And so it's why I love watercolor. So much you can do with it. I'm gonna paint in the tree trunk. And then what I'm gonna do real quick is dry this and then put in the grass at the end. Okay, now that that one is done, I'm gonna show you on the left side real quick. If you wanted to come in and add an even darker shadow once it's dry, how to keep that nice soft blended look. Because again, once it's kind of dry and then you come back and work into it, it's a little trickier. So what we're gonna do is mix up a darker green. I've got my Hooker's green, ultramarine blue, little cad red. Oops, way too much, got too dark on me. So I'm gonna add more Hooker's green in there and ultramarine blue. So what I'm gonna do is I'm coming in on dry paper, and so if I come in and put this down, you can see if I just left that, I now have a hard edge and it would look like the one on the right. So what I have to do is, I'm gonna finish kind of putting this in a few more spots first. I like adding this in wherever I'm gonna do it, and then I come back and I soften it. So, but this is also why I said you can use a combination of both, because that kind of even just looks pretty on there, having these harder edges now against the softness behind. Okay, we've got hard edges, so what we have to do is rinse our brush, and then I dab it on my paper towel so that it's just damp, and then I'm gonna come in and just slightly kind of touch the edging of where I was just painting. And then I'm gonna do the same thing, kind of just rinse my brush. And as you add just that little bit of the damp brush to those edges, it takes away the hard edge, because again, water is how everything kind of softens. And so that's really all I'm doing. I'm just having that little bit of water on my brush and letting that water just naturally soften those edges. And so I just kind of keep coming. Just keep repeating that process until I've gotten all of my edges. And again, you don't want a lot of water on your brush, you just want a damp brush. That's why every time I put it on my paper towel, because if you have excess water, you're gonna run into some problems with that. You just need a little bit of a damp brush, and that really just kind of does the trick. Okay, now that that's kind of softened in there, it's nice because it added a darker value on top, so it gave it a little bit more dimension. And so that's one way you can always kind of come in and continue to get a nice blended shadow, is just using a little bit of a damp brush. It's really your best friend. I kind of joke a lot of times, but half of when I'm painting with watercolor is just using my brush without any paint on it. It's using it to lift off. It's using it to soften and blend with just a damp brush. And so it's something I try and really stress to beginner watercolorists is don't feel like you always have to have paint on your brush to be using your brush on your painting. It actually works really well to have no paint and just come in, soften with a damp brush, lift off with, you know, just a little bit of water to add some highlights, all that kind of good stuff. So that is the difference between having a blended shadow and having a hard edge shadow. And really it comes down to blended is working wet on wet, or just making sure everything is being worked while it's still wet. And a hard edge is really just working on dry paper and then doing that for every layer. So with this, you have more layers. So I'm just gonna kind of put layering. And then wet onto wet, you can do it all like I showed you in one pass, or you can come back and add a second layer, get a little bit darker with a damp brush. But with the hard edge, you don't even have that option to do it in one layer because you have to dry it before you add your darker values to build up your form. So that's kind of like the main difference between the two. And then over here, we'll kind of put blended is really just doing soft edges. So play around with this, do one in the middle and combine the two, start off with soft blended edges and end with a few hard edges at the end and kind of do a mix and match is another great way to continue practicing. And I will see you guys in the next video.